bred New Yorker. Having a mom from New York taught me a lot of things. Mainly, you don't need a crosswalk to cross the street. It's not pizza if it's not dripping in grease. But most of all, Broadway shows are some of the most quality entertainment in the world. I grew up listening to all of the classics, Les Miserables, Phantom of the Opera. If it was a Broadway hit, we listened to it. So naturally, when I started to hear things about a new rap musical that was taking Broadway by storm, I was intrigued. Hamilton, a rap musical about one of America's founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. It sounds weird, but it's amazing. I love it. And it turns out Alexander Hamilton was actually a really interesting guy. This inspired me to learn more about who he was and what his life was like. And now I'm going to share all of that with you. Lin-Manuel Miranda's 2016 musical Hamilton described Alexander Hamilton as a bastard orphan, son of a whore, and a Scotsman. And I think this sentence kind of really describes what he came from. He was born out of wedlock in 1757 to Rachel Fawcett and James Hamilton on the Caribbean island of Nevis. He had a very difficult childhood filled with hardships. The island that he grew up on was filled with poverty. His father left when he was only a couple years old. When he was at 12 years old, him and his mother both contracted typhoid fever. His mother, unfortunately, passed away from this. The tragedies continued when he was 17 and a hurricane came and totally destroyed the island that he lived on. His life was one disaster after the next. This hurricane really affected Hamilton, and according to Ron Chernow's book, Alexander Hamilton, published in 2004, Alexander apparently responded to this disaster by composing a long, feverish letter to his father, trying to convey the hurricane's horror. Even at age 17, he was a fantastic writer. The letter was so impressive that it actually got published in a lot of publications on the island and the mainland. In fact, everyone on the island was so impressed with how he wrote their tragedy, they actually took up a collection to send him to the mainland, to New York, to get a real education. So, after getting to New York on the boat that all of the people from his homeland got for him, the Boston Tea Party inspired him to join the resistance effort against the British. According to Thomas McCraw in his article, The Strategic Vision of Alexander Hamilton, published in 1994, Hamilton published a 14,000-word essay entitled A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress, an impressive but not astonishing debut which called for action against British colonial policy. Thus began Hamilton's involvement in the American Revolutionary War. As soon as the fighting broke out in Lexington and Concord, Hamilton joined the war effort. As written in the article, Hamilton Takes Command, published by the Smithsonian in 2003, Hamilton was swept up by revolutionary fervor, and at age 20 dropped out of King's College and formed his own militia unit of about 25 men. His superiors quickly noticed how brilliant and what a natural leader he was, and he quickly rose through the ranks of the military. He was offered many positions on the staffs of prominent military leaders, but he turned them all down in pursuit of glory on the battlefield. Turned them all down, that is, until George Washington himself requested that he join his staff. Of course, you don't turn down George Washington, so he accepted. His participation on George Washington's staff became very important to the American war effort. And in fact, his collaboration with French revolutionary Marquis de Lafayette was integral to the Americans' final success at the Battle of Yorktown. Now, while the war was still being fought, at a ball in the late winter of 1780, Hamilton met the stunning Elizabeth Schuyler, who was the daughter of one of the richest and most influential men in New York. Hamilton was immediately in love. He wrote her beautiful love letters while away at war, and in December of 1780, they were married. As documented by Jenny Presnell in her article, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, published in the American National Biography, the Hamiltons' personal relationship was one of mutual respect. Alexander would solicit her advice on political and family matters. Alexander and Eliza had a loving and strong marriage, until Alexander had an affair with Mrs. Maria Reynolds, while Eliza was away on vacation with their children. Unfortunately for Hamilton, Mrs. Reynolds' husband found out about the affair and blackmailed him. Faced with an impossible choice, he decided to pay the man instead of having his wife find out about his indiscretions. It stayed a secret for a couple years until some political rivals found out about it and threatened to expose him. Deciding that it was better to come clean, Hamilton wrote the Reynolds Pamphlet, which was a document distributed to the public that explained every gory detail of his affair. His wife was heartbroken, and their marriage, while still technically intact, was essentially over. A couple years later, their oldest son Philip passed away in a duel while defending his father's honor. This tragedy wrecked both Eliza and Alexander, and the tragedy brought them back together. Their sorrow brought them together, and Eliza eventually ended up forgiving him. They had a strong and happy marriage for the rest of his life. Now, after the war, Alexander went back to school to get his law degree and became arguably the most successful lawyer of his time. He used his skills as a lawyer to help defend the new Constitution in a publication entitled The Federalist Papers, published in 1788, where he wrote, "The Constitution ought to be the standard of the constructions of the laws, and that wherever there is an evident opposition, the laws ought to give place to the Constitution." Hamilton's eloquent writing successfully accomplished its goal of getting the Constitution ratified. And later, when George Washington was named the first president of the United States, it was no surprise when he asked Hamilton to be the first Treasury Secretary. As written in Richard Brookhiser's article, A Founding Father's Return to Grace, published in 1999, in 3 years as Treasury Secretary, he consolidated the debt and established a national bank. This ingenious financial plan gave the new U.S. government a badly needed line of credit, and probably saved our country from financial ruin. After George Washington left the presidency, Hamilton was fired as Treasury Secretary, and he lost a lot of his political influence. He left the political sphere until a couple years later when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were competing for the presidency. He strongly disliked both men, but in the end decided to throw his support behind Thomas Jefferson. When Jefferson ended up winning the presidency, Aaron Burr was enraged that Hamilton had so totally defamed his character. In his rage, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel, which Hamilton accepted. On June 28, 1804, Hamilton and Burr dueled at sunrise. When the time came, Hamilton aimed his pistol towards the sky. Burr aimed his straight ahead. Hamilton was shot and died a couple hours later with Eliza by his side. Alexander Hamilton was one of the most controversial and interesting founding fathers, but he was the only one who died young and died violently. He is often forgotten about or underappreciated when we think about the founding fathers, but he was most definitely one of the most important people in shaping our country. I hope that now you appreciate this infamous founding father just a little bit more.
Okay, Marta.